in 2021. So, Eric recently described one of my swords as a Frankensword. I agree with that term. It's a good one. I'm going to keep using it. So, what is a Frankensword? A Frankensword is kind of a leftover hodgepodge. So they took the blade of a sword they used to manufacture that's been discontinued that they had left over and married it with a hilt. You know. Oh, look at this glow above my head. First up is this reconstruction I did. One of the first two swords I ever bought in '95 was a William Wallace style sword. And unfortunately, it was right at the time period that Deltin was being dropped by Winless, and Winless started manufacturing their own version of it. The version by Deltin was definitely superior. The one I had weighed over 7 pounds, no distal taper, and no parallel taper, you know. And it was heavy and crowbar-like. The handle I did in kind of a suede leather with that thin wrapping of, what is it, linen, wax linen cord, yeah. And held it all together. Now, the handle itself is pretty solid, but it was an experiment. It was the second one I did with the experimental method. You can see it's kind of lumpy. And what it actually is paper mache under there. Paper mache that every few layers I'd wrap with twine to compress it. And it came out pretty hard and solid and not too heavy. So, kind of like it. Interesting thing about the sword is I had no way to peen it. So, if you notice, you can see the end of the tang down in there. But there's no peen. It is literally just pressure fitted to the pommel, but it's never come loose. Now, the one thing about this blade is, it's a nice looking blade, but it's a little whippy. You see, I wiggle that and it wiggles a lot. I don't think it's necessarily so whippy I couldn't sharpen it and use it, but I think it's just a little whippier than I'd want, and I think it would be a pain to deal with. So I've left it kind of blunt and just use it as a decoration, but also as a practice weapon. This sword is probably the first sword I ever assembled myself. I'm never fully happy with it. Put the runes on there that on one side of the blade say, never drawn without purpose, nor sheathed without honor on the other side. And I made it from this part of a tree that I felled at some point in my past to partially do a war club with for my friend, the war club. Now this blade here is off a fantasy scimitar that Winless offered many, many years back. On the other side, and ironically, this kind of came out looking like Arwen's sword from Lord of the Rings, although I made this sword, oh gosh, when was that, late 90s? It was definitely before 2000. Leather here on the grip keeps coming undone. I redid it a couple times, but it's a perfectly round handle, as you can see, which seems bad, except for this stud lines up with that line. So you hold it, that stud points forward, and this stud points forward, and you kind of feel it, and this is on the side, so you kind of feel where the blade is. Here. Never drawn without purpose, nor sheathed without honor. That's an old English adage, a duelist adage, and at the bottom I just did some stud work and there to kind of help protect it, but I blackened it using I used basically a blowtorch, I don't remember if I used map gas or propane, but regardless, I got it that way. And well, so it's sort of elven in design, but also sort of dwarven in nature. So people often ask me if this sword, the all frame there, would actually function. Well, probably. Blade itself is pretty darn stiff. It's got a good resiliency there. And the tang itself sinks into about maybe here. So it's beyond your hand. Now, the blade itself is tough enough. I also assembled myself from what is originally this was off, the blade type was off a Winless sword that was a Mongol sword, or Mongol Ild type saber that they'd made. And the guard and pommel are off two different Winless swords. I have no idea which one this came off of. This came off their fantasy Drizzt sword, the dark elf from the D&D novels, and it was either Icing Death or Twinkle's pommel. I can't remember. Itself is another experiment. It was also paper mache, but this one I kind of fucked up on because I did not add any flour to the mix, and it is just glue and paper essentially with twine. So it's a very lightweight handle. It's been sturdy, it's been solid, but it's much lighter, so it doesn't pull the balance back much on the blade. But I chose this pommel One, because I couldn't find any other pommel that I really liked with this guard, but two, because it sort of looks like a Katzbalger pommel. And what it looks like is one of these. I don't know how to say this name here. I think it is Skilvonesia, maybe? I don't know. But it looks like one of those, except for the pommel is wrong now. I'll show you on the next sword. What I may do is switch the pommels, perhaps. But this pommel matches this guard better than the other pommel would match this guard. But this guard would make it better. Now, I don't know if that's the same proportions as the one pictured here from museums and stuff. But it certainly looks like basically the same type of blade and guard. The grip also is just wound. It's just wound lacing. All right. I've done a few sword handles like that. It works well. You just pull it tight. And then I did black fingernail polish over here and kind of red and black mixture to make that kind of ox blood, which is not showing up very well on camera. It looks like yuck, but it actually looks more red in person. And then I glued, those little nodules are actually a art sand someone gave to me, and it was a little rough on the hand, so I filed it. Now that's why they're a little white. So I filed it with a file, and now it's really grippy, but does not bite into your hand. I think the originals had hilts long enough to use hand and a half or possibly two-handed, but I had to stop where the tang stopped. So can you fit two hands on? Certainly. Can you loop a pinky over here and get a little more in there? Yeah, certainly. Right? And even if you wanted to, you could put fingers this way and kind of grip it and get enough extension that you can kind of use it two-handed. Not too much of a problem. Now, if you overextend this way, of course, this will bite into your hand here like that. So it kind of reminds you to keep the sword at a certain angle when cutting, but single-handed it works fine. It's just a little long on the grip. Balance point is, I don't know where. It's fairly far out, but it's not a heavy blade by any means of the imagination. Stretch the imagination means whatever, but right about there. Now this sword is one of my favorites I've made because it looks the best, although I did the least amount of work on it. The scabbard is kind of a brownish oxblood where the handle's more red, but kind of because they kind of look alike. Now, the blade, the guard, the grip, and the pommel I all found at one sale at once. The blade was in the scabbard, found the guard and pommel in a box beneath the table, and the handle, I forget where it was, somewhere else in the sale, but they all went together nicely. Now, if I took that pommel and put it on the previous sword I just showed you, it would be more historically accurate. But you see, these both have that unfinished rough look, and the last two were shiny, which is why I didn't match them that way. Now, were there swords like this in history that look like this? Pretty much, yeah. I think so. I'm not sure about the pommel, but the rest of it seems to be like an early saber falchion type thing. Tang on this one comes to the end, and although the sword is entirely super glued together, it has never fallen apart in all the years I've had it. But the tang came through and actually was a little bit longer, so I just cut it with a hacksaw and filed it down. But it's one of those Italian kind of square pommels. A little thicker than some, but not bad. Which does create kind of a gap around the handle. But at the same time, I just bought the parts separately and fitted them together, so I didn't have much choice on the fitting there. But oxblood leather, kind of wrapped in a spiral, where it overlaps forward so that your hand slides easier up than it does back, which is good. So having no distal taper, unfortunately this not overly long blade is pretty forward balanced. It's like here. Now that's about where the last sword balanced, but the last sword has a much lighter blade and handle. So yeah, this is probably 7.5 inches out. So it feels hefty in the cut, more so than I'd want. The saber's flex. It is not much flex. Very stiff. I think if I basically carefully set that down, the blade's kind of shaped like this. If I thin it like that, I think I can get enough meat out of, from maybe like here up, that it would lighten enough to feel more comfortable. It's not horrible. I mean, it's not unusable, I should say. Horrible maybe, but it's heftier than some arming swords, and it's definitely shorter, but it's pretty good cutter. I didn't put the greatest of edges on it. It's kind of goes like this and then kind of really out. The next sword I'm going to show is this sword. Ooh, look at that. Nice Greek blade, right? I thought it was a Gladius blade when I bought it at the sale because it was in plastic. I paid probably 10-15 bucks for it. Got home and suddenly realized, oh, wait, it's Greek. Not a big deal. I just thought it was a wasp-waisted Gladius. But what I did to it was add this horrible hilt. Now, I say horrible. It doesn't look too well. I'll get the light on that now. There we go. Adjust with me. So it's not horrible, but this is a perfectly round handle. I need to do something about that, and this is just too chunky. Need to shape that down. So, but this was a rough. That's not actually a tang. That's just a tack nail thing. Furniture tack. So I got to probably sand across this way some to make it where you can feel the edge, and then shape this down some. And so you can see it. You see that different coloration around here? What happened was when I drilled the hole to put the handle in this ball, it was a little too wide. That's why the Gorilla Glue I was using foamed up and overfoamed and flowed down. Golly, that light is just not working with me tonight. But overflowed and created this pattern on the wood. I didn't create it at first, but once I tried to stain the wood, where the Gorilla Glue was lighter, and it came darker where it wasn't. So it kind of made a nifty pattern. I just left it. What I was thinking of doing is, because I have room here, is building up a platform here out of something, wood probably, maybe paper mache. So it has that shelf under the guard like a gladius would. It's this side versus this side. Yeah, you'll see that the blade sides don't quite line up. This side here is definitely cut in more. I think that's because I used one of those hand tool sharpeners like a lot of people are saying to use on swords these days. Yikes. No, they take off way too much steel. And because of that, in my sharpening, when I was learning to sharpen, I'm still not great at it, but back in the day, yeah, it took off way more steel on this side than that side. And now it is slightly misshapen in the blade, if you look closely. Scalagram had bought this very same sword that had this guard, this handle, but it had a blade that looked just like this instead. Ooh. If you've ever seen his old video about worst bought swords, one of them, it was in one of them. I can't find it tonight to link it, but essentially that guard and handle with this blade. I like the design of it too, so Skull, don't feel bad. The sword is shit. Was shit. But it was kind of nifty looking, so I bought it. Now, what I did with the blade here is, the blade is actually pretty thick and stiff. Oh, I can't flex it. What I did was wrap the handle with this. It's the wrappings off a cheap decorative Japanese sword that I took apart and have used. The guard, like the guard is what I use for my Korean sword and some of its accents. And I have a sword coming up, I'll show you that used part of it. And this pommel was originally a pommel I had on a mangosh. So I wedged it on the end of the little tang there. Now this tang used to have just a little rat tail at the end that screwed on to hold the thing together. And the tang's actually pretty thick going through. This is as wide as the tang is. So, but this part is where that, right where the pommel sits, is where that guard used to sit. So this was part of the actual blade of the sword. So that's why it's so thick here and solid. So the little rat tail tang went through the handle, and it was not a usable sword. But now I made it into this machete-like weapon. All these little shapes under it are just, like on the side how it's built up. You can kind of see what a tang is. They're just slats of wood that I assembled and wrapped around. So you can hold it this way, and because that tang protrudes, the light's still not working. Tang protrudes slightly, there you can see it. From the handle, it fits right between your hands, and you get a good grip. Now, you can either hold it like this and have a little bit of a thumb rest there, like a saber grip, or you can choke up, put your thumb there as a ledge, kind of do like a more machete chop or whatever. It's not double edge, it's single edge, but still has a spear-ish point, even though it's not quite in line. If you look at that, it's lying off one side still. But it's kind of a nice little machete tool I used out of made out of a spare part. Transition between swords I've assembled and true Frankenswords. We'll go with this one. Now, is that a rapier and dagger? No, it's actually not. These are transitioning because this one I pretty much bought as you see. This one I kind of assembled, but they're sort of a match set, and I'll show you why. We'll start with this dagger. Now, this blade has a long story in my armory because it started off as the blade on the haphazard mangosh I made for my first rapier. Because I bought this blade that came with a kit. It was an Arkansas toothpick. It had a blade that kind of came out a little bit down, a little bit up. And I bought that pommel that was on the machete-like thing for it to match, but I had this blade left over. So what I did was take this pommel, which was originally on this sword that matches it, which I'll show you in a second. So I still need another pommel like this that I can use to match them all of us. Ongoing process. But this guard here looks like a fireman's emblem. It's actually the guard that was originally on my Korean sword before I remade it. And you see, that's brass and that thin. I would not trust my hand with that if I was in a sword fight. Now on a knife, it's fine because it's basically there to keep your hand going up the blade. But the reason I use a round guard on this is, well, it's all I had. Not true, I had one other guard, but pretty much all I had. But also this sword has sort of a roundish guard too, so it's in brass, so it kind of matched. So I added this pommel, and the balance point literally is in the guard, I think, because, yeah, right in the guard, so it's like nothing in your hand. All that little black gook you can kind of still see a little bit of was the epoxy melting through the handle and coming out, dripping out, and picking up all the scorching stuff from where they had burned the handle through. So put a spiked spiral to the grip. Now, nicely it lines up with the contours of my hand when I do like this. You can kind of feel it curving in the palm a bit. So it came out okay, but it definitely has a weird twist to it. So that is the matching dagger to this thing. Now, since this is not a rapier, it's actually too short to be a rapier. Yeah. What is it? Well, I didn't know for years. It's a rather thin blade, as you can see. Pretty thick. Yeah, all the way down. So it's got some heft. It balances really far out for what you think it would, because it is a rather hefty blade. I mean, it honestly feels as hefty as some arming swords I have felt, but it's so thin. Well, I'd never heard the term and never noticed it in the catalog, even though it's a pillow sword. What's a pillow sword? Pillow sword is a misunderstanding, in a way. Pillow swords were thin-bladed small swords, usually not with triangular blades, for understand, usually with a double-edged blade, but basically small swords, usually with a simple hilt, just a cross guard and a pommel, that people later centuries misassumed was kept by the bed at night for self-defense, hence pillow sword, but really they were just lightweight swords people often carried. Court swords is another word I think associated with them. In times where you probably needed a sword because it was considered part of the male costume at the time. It was essentially accessory jewelry type stuff, but you probably weren't going to get in a fight, maybe. I don't know. It definitely has a long grip where you can do a definite saber grip on it, and the pommel goes in the recess of your hand like that, so you can get it fully out. Like I said, it is definitely feels more like a small arming sword or something, like it's, or maybe like a saber. Maybe that's close, like a Napoleonic era saber or something. So it's got a fair amount of heft to it, which, as I understand it, pillow swords generally didn't. But it's not too heavy. It's just heavier than what it would have been. It's got a nice little ricasso and an interesting shape. You could put your thumb in that recess and do the Germany type thing. So it's a nice little, cool little sword. I just thought, kind of fun. And also, I mean, with the scabbard, you could potentially put a rubber foot on the end and use it as a sword stick. It'd be ridiculous. Paid $20 for it. I didn't think anybody would like it from me, but me when I bought it, because it's kind of awkward. But more people have tried to buy this sword off of me than any. And had I known that was going to be the case, I probably would have bought a couple of them, because like I said, they were $20. I didn't have a whole lot of money, but I could turn around and sell them for $50 each, I imagine at least. Let's see, that kind of looks, they have similar handles, so this one's longer and not as dark now, and a little bit different pommels, obviously, but they're both fluted. And they both have disc-esque guards with some cutaways in them. So that is the match set of pillow-ish sword and mangosh-ish dagger, I guess. But I like it as a set, and it kind of, you could, you know, obviously use sword and dagger or rapier and dagger techniques to a degree with it. So just thought it was a nice set. This was